What's up, everybody? I'm Kevin Grote, and this is my review of the Panasonic FZ1000. Now, in this review, I'm going to be as detailed as I possibly can. So, I've tried to split this into three different parts: the camera, the lens, and the overall image quality. So let's go ahead and jump right in. This is the Panasonic Lumix DMC-FZ1000, a $900 camera that shoots 4K video, 120 frames per second slow-mo at full HD, and sports a 25 to 400 millimeter lens. The camera is very lightweight. The whole camera, lens included, weighs 830 grams. The body alone of a 5D Mark III weighs 30 grams more than that. I consider this to be both a good and bad thing. Good because it's lightweight, and even if you're carrying it around all day hanging from your neck, you're not going to get tired. But it's also a bad thing because if you drop it, even once, it may not survive. I love the two dials that it has on the top of the camera. It has most of your normal modes on the main dial, plus a few extras for taking photos with pre-applied effects, which, by the way, are not very good. Most are cheesy and lower the image quality, but it's still fun to play around with them a bit, and they do still look better than what you can get on Instagram. The secondary dial is for your shooting mode. You've got single shot, burst mode, bracketing, timer, and time-lapse. This dial will only affect your camera if you're shooting photos. Single shot is for taking photos one shot at a time. Burst mode is for taking a series of photos quickly. The FZ1000 does a really good job with burst mode, and it really surprised me how fast it can take photos. With your camera set to RAW, it'll capture about 10 photos a second. If you shoot JPEG, the camera will allow you to enable the super high burst rate, and you can capture about 50 frames a second. Now with the bracketing mode, you set your exposure and press the shutter button like you normally would, but instead of taking one photo, it takes 3. The first photo is going to be underexposed by a third of a stop. The next photo will be exposed the way you set it in camera, and the third photo will be overexposed by a third of a stop. In timer mode, you can just set a timer so that after you press the shutter button, it'll take a photo either 2 or 10 seconds after you've pressed the button. The final mode on the dial is an intervalometer for time-lapse photography, and it's amazing. The camera allows me to set a start time, a shooting interval, and an image count of how many images I want to be in my time-lapse. It makes time-lapse photography super easy. I'm not a huge fan of the buttons, but that might just be because I'm a Canon guy, so having to learn a new button layout kind of threw me off. The weirdest thing for me was the back button. If you're in the menu and you want to exit the menu, you click the back button. Well, that same button is also delete. So if you're viewing photos, you can't press the back button to go back to shooting, because instead it'll ask you if you want to delete the current photo. Now, I rented the GH4 for a week, and even though the buttons are really similar to the FZ1000, I still found that the GH4 was slightly easier to use. Plus, if there ever came a time where I didn't know which button to press, the GH4 has a touchscreen, so that really helped. The FZ1000 does not have a touchscreen, but it's still a very nice LCD screen. It's easy to swivel and turn. The camera has a microphone jack on the left side, and on the right side it has a remote jack, micro HDMI slot, and AV/digital out. I was obviously a little bummed when I found out that the camera wasn't going to have a headphone jack on it, but like I said before, I'm a Canon guy, so I'm kind of used to it. The camera will allow you to monitor your audio on the screen while you're recording, so even if you can't hear it through headphones, you can at least see whether anything needs to be adjusted. Now, the micro HDMI slot apparently outputs a 4K 8-bit 422 signal. It records internally to an SD card at 420, so if you can record 422 to an external recorder, it'd be nice to have that extra color. The electronic viewfinder is pretty impressive. Being a video guy who's used to Canon DSLRs, I've never even had the option of using the viewfinder. I think it's very clear and easy to see. In bright light, it's really helpful when seeing if your image is properly exposed or not. It's also helpful if you need to focus up your shot. The camera has focus peaking, and that's really helpful when trying to find your focus. The camera allows you to select from AVC HD or MP4. Recording 4K or 120 frames per second will record MP4. but if you want to record 24 frames per second, you must be recording ABC HD. Although it only allows you to record 24 frames per second at full HD, not 4K. The camera's Wi-Fi functionality is very helpful in certain situations. The app that Panasonic created is fantastic. It allows you to connect easily using a QR code. Rather than typing in a password, you can just scan the QR code in the Panasonic app and it connects automatically. You can change camera settings, even zoom in and out using the app on your phone. Granted, it's slightly delayed, but even if you have your camera up on a jib or somewhere out of reach, it's nice to be able to change settings without physically touching the camera. I attached my camera to a large jib, connected my phone to the camera, and had no problem at all tracking people's movement with the jib while using my phone as a monitor. The app also allows you to view photos and video from your mobile device and even transfer the files to your device wirelessly. Alright, now let's talk about the lens. The FZ1000 sports a 25 to 400 millimeter lens. At least that's what they tell you. What they don't tell you is that when you're shooting video, your sensor is slightly cropped, giving you different focal lengths than 25 to 400. For example, if you're shooting 4K, the lens becomes a 37 to 592 millimeter. When shooting full HD at 60p and 30p, along with 720p at 30p, the lens becomes a 28 to 448 millimeter. That is all with the stabilizer turned on. If you turn off the stabilizer, it'll change slightly. What was 28 to 448 now becomes 26 to 416 millimeters. When shooting high-speed video, which is 120 frames per second at full HD, the lens becomes a 32 to 512 millimeter lens. Also, when shooting 120 frames per second, the stabilizer is automatically disabled. Now, the stabilizer is pretty nice, but when you've zoomed all the way in, it struggles a bit. If I'm shooting video handheld and I want to zoom all the way in, I usually use the electronic viewfinder so that I can rest the camera up against my head to help stabilize it. Even with that, the stabilizer will still disappoint me most of the time. Now, if I'm shooting 4K, I'm zoomed in almost to 600 millimeters. I can't exactly expect the stabilizer to be perfect. It's a $900 camera. Now, the lens only has one ring that acts as both your focus and your zoom. Using the switch on the side, you can choose whether you want the ring to control zoom or focus. It does everything electronically, and this is probably my biggest complaint with the camera. It doesn't keep your speed consistent whether you're controlling zoom or focus. I tend to leave this switch on focus and just use this switch here to control my zoom. The build quality of the lens feels pretty good, but it's definitely not perfect. When the camera's off, you can tell that the stabilizer isn't really doing anything, and it's kind of just lightly holding the actual elements of the lens in place. If you gently shake the camera, you can actually hear the elements moving around. The lens has a maximum aperture of f2.8 to f4.0, which isn't great, but it's a 25 to 400 millimeter lens. I don't think a lens out there exists with that wide of a focal range and still maintains a constant aperture. I think the biggest complaint that people will have about this camera, and the number one reason why people would choose not to buy it, is because it has a fixed lens. The lens cannot be removed. Now, I totally understand that. I'm a Canon guy, I have Canon lenses. There have been many times, like in a low light situation, when I wish I could take this lens off and put on my 50mm f1.4, but I can't. On the positive side, you don't have to worry about your sensor getting dirty. You see this? This is a beautiful shot taken with the FZ1000. Now, despite everything that I do not like about this lens, you cannot deny that it still takes beautiful images. It lets me zoom in farther than I've ever been able to before, and the macro capabilities of this are actually really impressive. You can get centimeters away from something and still keep it in focus. The lens does support autofocus during video recording, but like all the other cameras out there, it's not very good. My wife wanted to make a makeup tutorial, and since she was going to be moving forward and backward, I figured it would be a good opportunity to test out the autofocus. Even when she was sitting still, the camera really liked to focus on the wall behind her. I'd say that she was actually out of focus more than 50% of the time, even though she was the only thing moving in the frame and was in the center of the shot. Alright, let's talk about image quality. It has a 1-inch sensor, which is smaller than a micro four thirds sensor. This small sensor is going to mean less depth of field and more noise in low light situations. I did a short comparison video of the GH4 and the FZ1000 in low light, and it seemed like they didn't really look much different. But obviously with the GH4 you can put a fast lens on it and keep your ISO down lower. That's not something you can do with this camera. As you can see here, the overall image quality of the FZ1000 is really nice. If I were to look at a side-by-side comparison of the FZ1000 and a GH4 with a similar lens, I don't know if I'd be able to tell the difference. The quality is just beautiful. Looking at some of these samples, I don't know how you could not be impressed with this $900 camera. Even the full HD looks fantastic. The compression is far better than any Canon DSLR I've ever worked with. One feature that the FZ1000 really needs is sharpness control. Straight out of the camera, the image is just a little bit too sharp for me, and sadly I can't change that. Now, one feature that it does have that's really helpful is highlight and shadow control. Here's a shot of my living room with the normal settings. Here's another shot, but with the shadows turned up by 5 and the highlights turned down by 5. Obviously, you get better dynamic range, but it definitely adds a lot more noise. Here's a shot right after sunset at 400 ISO. There pretty much shouldn't be any noise in the shot, but because I had my highlights down and my shadows up, it added a lot more noise. Alright, I know a lot of you are probably really interested in the 120 frames per second slow-mo, so let's jump right in. When you enable the high-speed mode, it records 120 frames per second in full HD. Like I mentioned earlier, when shooting slow-mo, you don't have stabilization. It's a bummer, but it's not the end of the world. My biggest complaint with the slow-mo is that you lose full manual control. You no longer have control of your shutter speed, your ISO, or your aperture. Instead, you're just given an exposure meter which you can turn up or down. That's it. I wish there was an option in the menu to give you full manual control, but there's not. Now, when you've started recording in slow motion, you can't adjust your zoom, and you also can't use autofocus. It just doesn't allow those features to work. It may not be the best slow-mo out there, but it's better than not having any slow-mo, and it still does a pretty good job. Here's some comparisons of the different video modes that the camera can record. As you can see, the quality drops a lot when you're shooting in high-speed mode. It also introduces a lot of noise into the shadows. Even though it's recording in full HD, it doesn't look nearly as nice as the full HD that the camera records at 60 or 30 frames a second. But it's still better than your iPhone, so it's technically still a point in the camera's favor. Since I've had the camera, I haven't had a single 4K shot with moire. Now if you're shooting 1080, it does introduce some moire, but the extra detail in the 4K helps eliminate that. The camera does have a rolling shutter problem, but it seems a little better than most Canon DSLRs. Now I'd like to note a few more things about the camera. Some were previously mentioned, others were not. It does not shoot 24 frames a second at 4K, only 30. It records at 100 megabits per second when shooting 4K. I bought one of these new super high-speed SD cards to record 4K, but surprisingly enough, my old SD cards are able to capture 4K. I don't know if that's good for the SD card though. Also, keep in mind that the camera doesn't shoot true 4K, which is 4096 by 2160. It technically shoots Ultra HD, which is 3840 by 2160. Now, Ultra HD is 16 by 9, so that doesn't bother me because if I was shooting true 4K, I would just end up cropping it to 16 by 9 anyways. If you set your zoom and focus and then turn the camera off, your camera will not remember that information the next time you turn it on. So if you zoom in to 100 millimeters and turn off the camera, the next time you turn it on, it won't be at 100 millimeters. You've got to zoom in again and refocus. The camera displays audio levels while recording, but it doesn't allow you to adjust those levels while recording. You also cannot adjust the white balance while recording. The camera has a feature for long exposure noise reduction when taking photos, but honestly I didn't notice a difference. When you first get the camera, your ISO steps are limited, so in order to adjust your ISO by a third of a stop, you must find and enable that option in the menu. The battery life of the camera is fantastic. I went to the fair, I used it for most of the day, and when the day was over, I still had like a third of my battery left. The photo quality of the camera is nice, but it's really nothing special. I'd say it's probably on par with the Canon Rebel series. If you want to use this camera for night photography, this is not the camera for you. I tried shooting a time-lapse of the stars, and whether I was shooting at 3, 5, 10, or even 30-second exposures, the camera really wasn't picking up that many stars. I felt like it could see only 10% of the stars that I could see with my naked eye. When reviewing your photos and videos on the SD card, the camera really struggles to load the video files. You can go through your photos quickly, but as soon as you run into a video file, it slows down and you have to wait like 2 to 3 seconds before you can just click to the next file. So really quickly, I just want to give a few pros and cons before I wrap this up. Pros. It has amazing video quality in good light. It's got a pretty crazy optical zoom. The 120 frames per second slow-mo is really cool. The photo burst mode is faster than any other camera I've encountered. The electronic viewfinder is really helpful in bright light, and the camera outputs a 4K 8-bit 422 signal out the HDMI. Cons. The lens rattles. The stabilizer struggles at extended focal lengths. A better max aperture would be nice. The slow video viewing is kind of frustrating. The sensor is cropped when you're shooting video. It's noisy in low light. The lens is controlled electronically and it doesn't have a headphone jack. Well, that's pretty much it. Despite all of its problems, I still love this camera. I think the image quality is so incredible, I'm totally willing to work around its issues. That's all I have for you, so I'm just going to leave you with some more footage from the camera. Thanks for watching.